Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in systematic theology by Professor John Frame. We're going to take a look at 405 to 414, and it's the doctrine of God in Himself. God in Himself. Very important doctrine, and what it really is, it's the doctrine of worldview, Christian worldview. Now, he calls it God in Himself, but basically it's a doctrine of Christian worldview, and from three perspectives. And he forms the same conclusion as we've been learning from Ross, that any Christian worldview represented as a sign model must be a circle of God in Himself, and then God going out of Himself to create, and then God redemptively lifting humanity back into return to Himself. So it's the sign model that Ross has been sharing is a circle, and John Frame posits the same position. A Christian worldview must be a circle. And we're going to look at it in those three moments of God in Himself, God going out of Himself, and God returning to Himself. Very important lesson. Let's go to block one and get started. God in Himself as normative. As normative, God is the I am of Exodus 3:14. He is independent in His existence. He is independent in His perfections. He is God in Himself. Now, as situational, God is absolute controlling authority. God is present in our lives as blessing and judgment. And God is never moved by something outside Himself. Now, as existential, we experience God as personal presence of blessing and judgment. God goes out of Himself in time, but with atemporal decrees. God does determine our history. So here's our outline. Normative, God is in Himself. Situational, God goes out of Himself as creative control. Existential, God returns to Himself by lifting all of creation up to the return through blessing and redemptive judgment. So there you go. That's your circle. There it is. The same diagram has been presented by Ross in lenses. God goes out of Himself as creative control. Normative, God is in Himself. Situational, God goes out of Himself as creative control. Existentially, God returns to Himself, but at the same time by lifting all of creation up in that return through His redemptive blessing and redemptive judgment. Let's go on to block two. So block one was God in Himself as normative. Now block two is God goes out of Himself as situational. He goes out of Himself as control and authority. God is the first giver, Psalm 50. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. So God goes out of Himself as our deliverer. In worship, we thank God for meeting our many, many needs. In God, we live and have our being. In God, we have our very existence. There is no existence outside of God, period. Revelation calls being cast outside of God second death. There is no existence outside of God. Galatians 4:8-9. You have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God. So God goes out of Himself in a very relational way to actually, by His grace and by His love, to know us in a relational way. And Paul recognized that in his letter to the Galatians. You have come to know God, or rather, more accurately, you have come to be known by God. So, God goes out of himself to know us in a relational way, because foundationally, God is our covenant Lord. Romans 11:36. From him, and through him, and unto him are all things. And again, Paul, the theologian, is speaking of Christ, who is co-eternal and co-substantial with the Father. From him, and through him, and unto him are all things in creation. God receives everything in the return moment back into himself, but he receives everything in the return moment as redeemed, as lifted up through his redemption covenant. God becomes our personal Father, and God becomes the norm of our ethics. God and Christ. Christ is co-eternal with the Father. So God goes out of himself as control and authority. God goes out of himself to deliver us. God goes out of himself to know us in a relational way. God, because he is agape, sacrificial love, God desires to know us in a relational way. So we've looked at God in himself as normative. We've looked at God going out of himself as situational. Now we look at God returning to himself as existential. It's the return of lifting creation through blessing and judgment. Lifting creation through divine compassion and divine mercy. Through divine compassion and divine mercy. Creating in us Sabbath rest and a blessed assurance. We are confident that God's promise, God's communication is true. And God is knowing us through his eternal redemptive covenant. God knows us through his eternal redemptive covenant established before creation between the Father and the Son. God knows us through his eternal redemptive covenant, through his eternal redemptive plan. So God returns to himself in the return of lifting creation to himself through his redemptive plan. And here you go. Frame goes to Moltmann. Moltmann says we understand God's very being from the event of the cross. We understand God in his suffering for us, in order to overcome suffering in a redemptive way. Christ's sufferings are the sufferings of God. God suffers for us in order to overcome suffering for all eternity, in order to redeem us, in order to deliver us according to the eternal redemptive covenant established before creation between the Father and the Son. So I want you to understand this, and the best way to understand it is to go back to 1:3, that this is a theological worldview being taught here. It's a theological worldview. Normative. We begin with God in himself. But then God goes out of himself to create, and he sustains that process through creative control. And then existentially, God returns to himself, but with a creation that he is lifting up through blessing and judgment to reunification with the eternal Godhead. So it's a circle. The worldview being presented here is a theological circle. God in himself goes out of himself to create and to redeem, and then God returns to himself, but by the incarnate power of the Holy Spirit, he lifts all of creation up into reunification with the Godhead through blessing and through judgment. Through redemptive blessing and through redemptive judgment. Where do we live right now? We're living in that fullness of time. We're living in the time of the coming of Christ. The coming of Christ in every future moment. The coming of Christ and the coming of the Spirit that lifts us into perfect reunification with the Father through the blessings and the judgment of the good news, the gospel. The gospel has the power to raise us up. The gospel has the power to reunite us with our Father. The gospel has the power to lift us into the return moment of God returning to himself. We are lifted up into the triune history of the Godhead itself. We become partakers of inheritance, eternal inheritance. So the worldview here is a theological circle. And Ross has been teaching us in lenses a sign model that is a sign model of a circle, of God going out of himself to create, and then through the cross of Christ, returning to himself by, at the same time, lifting all of creation into new heaven and a new earth, which is called return moment. So the model we see that Ross has been teaching us is in perfect agreement with John Frame here, that our sign model of a biblical worldview is a theological circle. We begin with God in himself. Then God goes out of himself to create and also to sustain creation through his loving creative control. But then existentially God returns to himself. And in the return, the Holy Spirit lifts all of creation up to reunification through divine blessing, through divine redemptive judgment. And that implies relationship. Block 2, note 3. God goes out of himself to know us in a relational way. God is our covenant Lord. Romans 11:36, from him, through him, and unto him are all things. From God in himself, through God going out of himself, and unto God returning to himself are all things. Everything is taken up into the triune history of the eternal triune Godhead. God, I love this statement from Frame, God receives everything in return moment back into himself as redeemed. As redeemed. We know God as our personal Father. Christ said, when you pray, pray, our Father who art in heaven. Christ has restored our personal relationship to our Father in heaven. God receives everything in the return moment back into himself, but as redeemed through his Son, through the eternal gospel. It's an extremely important lesson, and it is perfectly in tune with what Ross has been teaching us in lenses. If you look at the sign model that Ross has been teaching us, it's a circle. It is a circle. And Frame here teaches us a circle. We understand this lesson as God in himself as normative, then God going out of himself as situational, and then God returning to himself as existential, a return that lifts us up into the return moment of returning into the new heaven and the new earth in perfect reunification with the triune Godhead. That wraps up 405 to 414. Next time, 421 to 430 on the Trinity. Next time, 421 to 430 on the Trinity. That wraps up a tremendous lesson on biblical worldview, God in himself, God going out of himself, and God returning to himself. That wraps up 405 to 414.